In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was preparing for a future that military planners considered inevitable. Nuclear weapons had already been tested, and their destructive power was no longer theoretical. The central question was no longer whether a nuclear war could happen, but how it would be fought. Military doctrine required practical answers. Commanders needed to know whether troops could move through a battlefield after a nuclear detonation, how equipment would perform, and how quickly an offensive could continue. These questions could not be answered through calculations alone. Soviet leadership believed that real conditions required real testing. To carry out such an experiment, a large military training ground was selected in a sparsely populated region. The location allowed for controlled conditions while remaining far from major cities. Preparations began quietly, following standard military procedures. Thousands of soldiers were assigned to participate in what they were told were large-scale exercises. Infantry units, armored divisions, artillery, and aviation were assembled. Equipment was positioned at various distances from the planned detonation site. Defensive trenches were dug. Observation posts were established. For the soldiers involved, this was not presented as an extraordinary event. Nuclear weapons were mentioned only in abstract terms. The exercises were described as a test of combat readiness under difficult conditions. Orders were clear, direct, and not open to discussion. Most participants had limited understanding of radiation. Training materials focused on blast effects and shock waves. Protective measures were minimal and largely symbolic. The emphasis was on discipline and execution rather than personal safety. The operation was scheduled with precision. Timing, weather conditions, wind direction, and visibility were all carefully calculated. From a logistical standpoint, the exercise was impressive in scale and organization. Everything appeared controlled. What was missing was any serious consideration of long-term exposure. The assumption was that distance and time would be sufficient protection. The possibility that radiation could remain dangerous after the explosion was acknowledged, but its consequences were not fully addressed. As the day of the exercise approached, soldiers took their positions. They waited in trenches and vehicles, facing a future battlefield that had never before been tested in this way. None of them were told that they were about to become part of one of the largest human experiments involving nuclear weapons. On the morning of the exercise, weather conditions were checked repeatedly. Wind speed and direction were especially important. Commanders wanted radioactive fallout to remain within a predefined zone, minimizing its spread beyond the training area. Once conditions were deemed acceptable, the final preparations began. A nuclear bomb was loaded onto a bomber aircraft and flown toward the target area. The weapon was designed to detonate in the air rather than on the ground. An airburst would maximize blast effects while reducing the amount of radioactive material drawn into the soil. From a military perspective, this made the test more representative of a real battlefield scenario. At the scheduled time, the bomb was released. Seconds later, a flash brighter than the sun appeared over the training ground. The explosion created a fireball that expanded rapidly, followed by a powerful shock wave. Soldiers positioned several kilometers away were ordered to remain in their trenches, facing away from the blast. Even at that distance, the light penetrated closed eyelids. Moments later, the shock wave arrived. It flattened vegetation, damaged equipment, and shook the ground. Dust and debris filled the air. Observers recorded the effects on buildings, vehicles, and defensive positions that had been placed at varying distances from the epicenter. Within minutes, a mushroom cloud rose high into the atmosphere. From a purely observational standpoint, the detonation was considered successful. Instruments confirmed that the explosion occurred at the planned altitude and within the expected yield range. For the soldiers on the ground, the event was disorienting but brief. After the initial blast, there was silence. Orders were given to remain in position. No immediate movement followed. This pause was intentional. Commanders wanted radiation levels to decrease before sending troops forward, relying on time as the primary protective factor. What was not fully understood or communicated was how radiation behaved after such a detonation. While the most intense radiation dissipated quickly, radioactive particles remained suspended in the air and settled onto the ground, equipment, and uniforms. Invisible contamination was already spreading across the training area. Monitoring teams began taking measurements, but their focus was limited. Instruments were used primarily to assess whether troop movement could proceed, not to evaluate long-term health risks. Thresholds were based on operational necessity rather than medical safety. From a command perspective, the explosion marked only the beginning of the exercise. The nuclear detonation was a tool, not the objective. The real test was still ahead, determining whether an army could advance through a battlefield that had just been subjected to nuclear weapons. As radiation levels were judged to be acceptable, preparations were made for the next phase. Units were alerted, engines were started, orders were relayed through the chain of command. The battlefield was no longer theoretical. It was real, radioactive, and waiting to be crossed. Once radiation levels were assessed as acceptable for movement, the next phase of the exercise began. Troops were ordered to advance toward the area affected by the nuclear detonation. This phase was considered the most important part of the operation. It was intended to demonstrate whether a coordinated military advance could continue after the use of a nuclear weapon. Armored units moved first. Tanks and armored personnel carriers drove across terrain that had been exposed to intense heat and blast effects only a short time earlier. Tracks crushed ash, dust, and debris into the ground, redistributing radioactive particles across the surface. Infantry units followed, moving on foot behind the vehicles. Soldiers advanced according to predetermined routes. Some passed through areas where buildings and defensive structures had been deliberately placed to test their resistance to a nuclear blast. Others moved closer to the center of the explosion, approaching distances that would later be considered unsafe by modern standards. Protective measures were minimal. Standard uniforms were worn. In some units, gas masks were carried, but not consistently used. The primary concern was maintaining formation and completing the exercise objectives on schedule. Time spent in contaminated areas was limited only by operational requirements. Radiation exposure varied widely among participants. Those inside vehicles received some shielding, while infantry soldiers moving on foot were directly exposed to contaminated ground and air. Dust kicked up by movement settled on clothing, skin, and equipment. At the time, this contamination was not treated as a significant hazard. Dosimetry was inconsistent. Some units were accompanied by radiation monitoring teams, while others relied on general assessments made earlier. Individual exposure was rarely tracked. Data collection focused on the feasibility of troop movement rather than the cumulative doses received by personnel. The exercise continued for several hours. Orders were executed as planned. From a military standpoint, the operation was considered a success. Troops advanced through the affected zone, maintained communication, and demonstrated the ability to operate under post-detonation conditions. What remained largely unaddressed was the biological impact of this exposure. Radiation does not cause immediate pain or visible injury. Its effects accumulate silently. Soldiers had no way of knowing how much radiation they were absorbing or what that exposure might mean years later. After completing their objectives, units withdrew from the contaminated area. Equipment was inspected for damage, but decontamination procedures were limited. Vehicles and uniforms were often reused. In many cases, radioactive particles remained present long after the exercise had ended. For the participants, the day concluded like any other military operation. Reports were filed. Formations were dismissed. The experience was recorded as a successful demonstration of combat readiness in a nuclear environment. What was not recorded in the same detail was the cost at the human level. The advance through the contaminated zone had exposed thousands of soldiers to radiation that would follow them long after the exercise itself was over. After the troops completed their advance through the affected area, attention turned to evaluating the results of the exercise. From a military perspective, the primary question was whether command structures, communication, and movement had functioned as intended. Radiation was treated as one factor among many, not as the central concern. Radiation monitoring teams collected data across the training ground. Measurements were taken at fixed points, along routes used by troops, and near equipment that had been positioned close to the detonation site. These readings were used to map contamination levels and to determine whether continued operations were feasible. The interpretation of this data followed operational priorities. Thresholds were set based on what was considered acceptable for short-term exposure during combat. Long-term health effects were not the focus of the analysis. Radiation doses were evaluated in aggregate, not at the level of individual soldiers. In many cases, personal dosimeters were either not issued or not consistently used. Where measurements existed, records were incomplete. Exposure data was often summarized at the unit level rather than linked to specific individuals. This made later medical assessment difficult, if not impossible. Official reports emphasized that radiation levels had declined rapidly after the explosion. This was technically correct in terms of initial intensity. However, residual contamination persisted in soil, dust, and equipment. The difference between immediate radiation and long-term exposure was not clearly addressed in the documentation. Decontamination procedures were limited. Some equipment was washed. In certain areas, surface soil was removed. These measures were selective and based on visible contamination rather than comprehensive analysis. Uniforms worn during the exercise were frequently reused or returned to storage. Medical monitoring of participants was minimal. Soldiers were not systematically examined for radiation exposure following the exercise. No long-term health tracking program was established. At the time, this was consistent with prevailing military practices, which prioritized readiness and secrecy over follow-up care. Much of the collected data was classified. Access to detailed reports was restricted, and summaries provided to higher authorities emphasized the success of the exercise. The absence of immediate casualties reinforced the conclusion that the operation had been safe enough. What these reports did not capture was the cumulative nature of radiation exposure. Small doses received over a short period can still have significant biological consequences. Without precise records, the true scale of exposure remained uncertain. As a result, the official assessment focused on tactical success rather than human impact. The exercise entered military archives as a demonstration of capability. The radiation measurements became supporting data, not warnings. For the soldiers who had participated, there was no clear indication that anything unusual had occurred. They returned to regular duty. The exercise became a line in their service history, recorded without reference to the invisible exposure that had accompanied it. In the months and years following the exercise, participants returned to regular military service or civilian life. There was no formal notification that they had been exposed to radiation and no instructions regarding medical observation. For most, the event remained simply another large-scale training operation. Over time, some veterans began to experience health problems. These issues did not appear immediately and did not affect everyone in the same way. Symptoms varied widely and developed gradually, making it difficult to associate them with a single cause. As with many radiation-related conditions, the effects were delayed and often indistinguishable from common illnesses. Medical treatment followed standard procedures. Doctors focused on individual diagnoses rather than shared exposure history. Because the exercise itself was classified, many physicians were unaware that their patients had participated in a nuclear detonation scenario. Even when soldiers mentioned their involvement, the information was often dismissed or considered irrelevant. There was no centralized system to track the long-term health of participants. Military records did not include detailed radiation exposure data, and civilian healthcare systems had no reason to suspect a common origin behind scattered cases. Without documentation, establishing a causal link became increasingly difficult. For those seeking recognition or assistance, the absence of official acknowledgement posed a significant barrier. Requests for medical benefits or compensation required proof of exposure, which most veterans could not provide. Many documents remained classified or incomplete. In some cases, records were lost or never existed at all. Public discussion of the exercise was minimal. Information about nuclear testing was tightly controlled, and the involvement of soldiers was rarely mentioned. This silence was consistent with broader practices of the period, where military secrecy took precedence over transparency. As decades passed, some details gradually emerged through personal testimonies and declassified materials. Veterans shared their experiences, often emphasizing how little they had been told at the time. These accounts provided valuable insight, but they did not carry the weight of official recognition. The lack of a clear institutional response contributed to a sense of abandonment among many participants. They had followed orders, completed their objectives, and accepted the risks without understanding them. In return, their exposure remained largely unacknowledged. From an administrative standpoint, the exercise was considered closed. There were no mass casualties, no immediate crisis, and no visible failure. The long-term health consequences did not fit neatly into existing frameworks of responsibility. As a result, the burden of proof shifted to individuals. Each case became isolated, disconnected from the larger context of the exercise. The collective nature of the exposure was fragmented into separate medical histories, making the broader pattern harder to see. With time, the exercise faded from public awareness, but it did not disappear from history. As archives were gradually opened and personal accounts accumulated, a clearer picture began to form. The event was no longer viewed solely as a military demonstration, but as an example of how nuclear doctrine was translated into practice during the early Cold War. From a strategic standpoint, the exercise provided useful data. Commanders learned how blast effects disrupted formations, how equipment performed under extreme conditions, and how quickly troops could be moved after a nuclear detonation. These conclusions were incorporated into military planning and training doctrine. From a human standpoint, the conclusions were far less clear. The exercise revealed a fundamental imbalance between operational objectives and individual safety. Radiation was treated as an abstract variable, something to be measured, managed, and tolerated within acceptable limits. The long-term biological consequences of exposure were acknowledged in theory, but rarely integrated into decision-making. One of the central lessons of the incident lies in its administrative aftermath. Without systematic exposure records, long-term medical monitoring became impossible. This absence of documentation ensured that responsibility remained diffuse. Institutions could point to incomplete data, while individuals were left without the means to prove what had happened to them. The lack of closure was not accidental. It reflected broader structures of secrecy and prioritization. Acknowledging the full implications of the exercise would have required reassessing not only one operation, but an entire approach to nuclear readiness. That reassessment never fully occurred. Similar patterns can be observed in other nuclear-era experiments, both military and civilian. Short-term success often overshadowed long-term consequences. Exposure that did not produce immediate effects was considered manageable or insignificant. The delayed nature of radiation-related illness made accountability difficult to establish. Today, the exercise is studied primarily as a historical case. It illustrates how technological capability can outpace ethical frameworks, especially under conditions of geopolitical pressure. The decisions made were not the result of individual negligence alone, but of systems designed to value strategic advantage over personal risk. For the soldiers involved, the experience remains unresolved. Some received recognition years later, many did not. The passage of time has made definitive answers increasingly unlikely. What remains are fragments, documents, testimonies, and incomplete records. The exercise demonstrated that a nuclear battlefield could be crossed. It did not demonstrate how its human cost should be measured. That question was left unanswered, and in many ways, it still is.